Okay, but just one thing I need to ask you, Stella. Is my mom alive? I mean, she can't be that old, and I'm so sorry, Electra, but no, she isn't. She died many years ago. Oh, okay. Stella put out a tentative hand and placed it on mine. Do you need some time before I tell you what happened after we left the house on Fifth Avenue? No? I mean, you can't really mourn someone that you never knew, can you? I just needed to know. You can mourn the thought of her. I swallowed hard, because my grandmother was right. It was the end of any kind of fantasy I'd ever had of meeting my birth mother. I'd thought about her a lot when I was little and in trouble with Ma for doing something naughty. I'd imagine her, as I was sure most adopted kids did, as an angelic presence who would float in from the skies, wrap her arms around me, and tell me that she loved me unconditionally, however bad I'd been. I'm fine, I nodded. I just want to know everything now, so I can move on. When did you find out that Lankenwa wasn't your real mother? It was when she wanted to get married. Lankenwa was moving on to start a new life, and I wasn't going with her, so the two of them told me together. Were you upset when you knew the truth? No, because even though I was loved by her, she'd always played a secondary role to Cecily. I suppose you could say she was my nursemaid. It was Kuaya, Cecily, who had brought me up and who I'd always looked to as my mother. The problem was, Cecily suddenly realized that Lankenwa and I had come into the United States on a visa which had never been renewed, so we were both technically illegal aliens. Lankenwa was okay as she was marrying a US citizen, and in those days she automatically became one herself. But that left the problem of me. Cecily wanted to adopt me legally, but back then, it wasn't just unheard of but impossible for a white woman to adopt a Negro child. As Lankenwa was moving on, it was eventually decided that Rosalind would officially adopt me. Her husband Terrence was a lawyer, and through their activism, they had friends in high places. At the time, it was the simplest thing to do, so I became Stella Jackson in name and eventually got my citizenship and a US passport, even though I continued to live here with Cecily. Jackson. Of course. I hadn't connected the surnames before. Your Rosalind sounds like she was one hell of a woman. Oh, she was. And a huge influence on me throughout my life. It's difficult for you to imagine what it was like growing up as a young black woman in the 50s, which, if you know anything about American history, you'll recognize was the most incredible time for change for black people across America. Stella, I gotta be honest here. I know jack shit about any kind of American history. I went to school in Europe, where they just taught us our own. I understand. But even you must have heard of Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, I know of him, of course. Well, by the time I won a scholarship to Vassar in 1959 for my undergrad, just as Cecily and Rosalind had planned, the world here in the States was in turmoil. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights had been passed by the UN in 1948, which was the first step to stopping segregation. I went to college at a moment in time when the protests against it were at their height in the South. And of course, growing up with Rosalind and Beatrix as my mentors, I threw myself into the cause wholeheartedly. I still remember how they and Cecily celebrated in 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This meant that segregation— you know what that word means, don't you, Electra? Stella turned to me suddenly. Yes, separating the blacks from the whites. Exactly. Well, the Board of Education ruling technically only applied to schools, but it opened the floodgates on protests that argue segregation in any other place should become illegal too. That was when Dr. King began his rise to fame. He organized a boycott in the South after a young activist called Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white passenger. The boycott meant that no black person would get on one until segregation was removed, and it brought the bus companies in the South to their knees. Wow, I said, as I tried to take in what she was telling me. Even though this was all happening down south, the students here in the north organized protests to support them. Oh, Electra, Stella sighed. It's so difficult to explain to a young person such as yourself who takes your rights for granted, but back then, we were all driven by a cause greater than any single one of us. As Stella paused, and her gaze flew across the garden, I could see a light in it that told me she was remembering those glory days. Did you ever get arrested when you were protesting? I asked. A couple times, yes. And I'm proud to tell you that your grandmother has a criminal record. I was charged with the fray along with 6 of my college classmates. The police brutality was something else, but I didn't care. And nor did my friends, because what we were fighting for, a whole nation's freedom and the right to be treated equally to our fellow white Americans, mattered more. When all this activity culminated in the spring of 1963, I was in my last year at Vassar. The atmosphere at that time was amazing. 250,000 of us joined the March on Washington, and we all gathered peacefully to listen to Dr. King make his iconic speech. I have a dream, I muttered. Even I had heard of that. Yes, that's the one. 250,000 of us. Not one of us there showed any violence towards another. It was, Stella swallowed hard, a seminal moment in my life, in all sorts of ways. I'll bet, I nodded, selfishly eager for the history lesson to be over. So what did you do then? Stella chuckled. I took the obvious path and applied to law school at Columbia right here in New York, with only one thought in my head. I was going to become the greatest civil rights lawyer and activist that ever lived. I felt that God had sent me to America and given me all these opportunities with only one purpose in mind, to help others like me who hadn't been so fortunate. However, nothing in life ever goes according to plan, does it? What do you mean? Stella looked at me for a moment. You know, I think it's time for that cup of tea I promised you. I also bought some scones. Do you like scones? Are they a bit like a muffin with raisins? I think our housekeeper made them sometimes because Pa liked them. Kind of. Cecily and her friend Catherine just adored them. Sit here and I'll set everything out. So, I sat waiting for my grandmother